Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Reid.
Good morning.
Can I return once again to the topic of whether the Post Office did not wish to have ownership of or administer any of the redress schemes? You remember we discussed this on day one and we addressed it again on day two of your evidence. I'd like you to consider, if we may, an additional piece of evidence in the light of the answers that you gave. Can we see, please, WITN 0020-0300? You'll see that this is a witness statement of Thomas Cooper, who you'll know.
Indeed.
By way of reminder for others, he was the UKGI non-executive director on the Post Office Board for 5 years.
Yes, that's correct.
Between March 2018 until May 2023, when he was replaced by Lorna Grattan.
That's correct.
He gave evidence by way of reminder for the transcript in phases 5 and 6 of the inquiry on the 10th of June 2024.
Yes, that's correct.
And this is a subsequent witness statement of his addressing some phase 7 issues. Can we look, please, at page 11? Under the heading Operational Resourcing, and this is part of his statement which addresses the governance of and resourcing of the HSS. And he says, during this phase, there were discussions at the board about how the Post Office would operationally resource the compensation work streams. In spring 2020, the shareholder team contributed to those discussions by providing advice to the department concerning the separation of historical liabilities and compensation matters arising from the GLO from the business-as-usual commercial operations of the company. One option that was suggested was to transfer the management of Post Office's compensation-related liabilities into a newly created separate company wholly owned by His Majesty's government. This would have enabled the Post Office to focus on the strategic and operational issues it faced, whilst in parallel having a dedicated resource set up to deliver compensation to victims of the Horizon scandal. The alternative to this proposal was the establishment of a unit within the Post Office to handle all compensation-related matters. Paragraph 30. UKGI's advice was discussed with Post Office and His Majesty's Treasury, as well as the department. Herbert Smith Freehills assisted the Post Office in preparing its own paper on the topic, which was discussed at the board. The idea of separating the compensation work streams from Post Office received little or no support. The board determined that the Post Office would take responsibility for the compensation work streams itself, rather than pass it to His Majesty's government. It was decided that an internal unit would be set up within the Post Office, the Historical Matter Business Unit, now known as the Remediation Unit. That was set up in July 2020 and had a remit to deliver the legal and compensation work streams flowing from the GLO proceedings. And then just to complete this, having reflected on this decision and reviewed the advice that UKGI provided, as well as the board paper, one thing that's conspicuously missing from both documents is the claimant's perspective. Claimants were not approached to give their view at the time. In hindsight, the lack of trust that the claimants had in the Post Office should have been included as a factor in support of separation. We now know that trust remains a major issue for claimants, one example of which is the GLO claimant's refusal to have the GLO scheme administered by the Post Office. Given that, as of today, significant elements of compensation being delivered to sub-postmasters are being administered by the department, as well as the very significant strain that compensation has placed on Post Office's management, which has lacked the bandwidth to handle the multiple complex issues in front of it, I believe, with the benefit of hindsight, the option of separating the compensation from Post Office should have been considered more seriously. However, at the time, following the successful settlement of the GLO and the participation of the GLO claimants in the design of the HSS, there was a perception at the Post Office that a degree of trust in Post Office had been restored. It's possible, therefore, that even if UKGI's advice and the board paper had identified the issue of trust and captured it fully, the decision may well have been made the same in any event. Just going back to paragraph 30, please. In the third line, Mr. Cooper says that the idea of separating the compensation work streams from Post Office received little or no support, and the board determined that the Post Office would take responsibility for the compensation work streams itself rather than pass it to His Majesty's government. Is that correct?
I think recollections do differ. I am very clear that I have contemporaneous notes from May, June and July where the notion...
Sorry, and that's 2020?
Yep. Where the notion of a good bank and a bad bank was put forward by myself and Carla Stent, and Carla Stent was the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, and we were quite vociferous about the necessity to separate good bank from bad bank, by which I mean how could we ring-fence the different elements of these particular schemes. So I don't support the notion that it received little interest or little support from the board. I think the board were very aware of the amount of work that would be required, let alone the level of trust that needed to be established. So I have a different view and a different recollection.
Given that in any event there appears not to have been agreement with government that Post Office should not participate in or administer the compensation schemes, wouldn't that therefore present the ideal opportunity to tell the inquiry, when it was considering that issue, Post Office's view? Quite possibly.
As I mentioned yesterday, and I think indeed as we discussed on Wednesday, this was very clearly an instruction from the UKGI. It wasn't a shall we decide how to do this? What is the best way? So I'm very clear on that.
And when you say it was an instruction from UKGI, the instruction was to what effect?
To the effect that we would manage the compensation schemes.
So it's almost precisely the opposite of what Mr. Cooper says.
Yes, as I say, I'm very clear that this was something that wasn't a choice for the board. The board didn't have a choice about whether or not it would administer compensation schemes.
And again, given that that was, on your account, a significant difference with government, why wasn't that ventilated or submitted to Sir Win in any of the hearings that we had?
It's a good question. I can't answer that.
Thank you. That can come down. Can we just briefly address a couple of issues on Postmaster Neds? We've done this a couple of times already, a couple of points to clear up. You tell us in your first witness statement, there's no need to turn it up, it's paragraph 94, that they were not provided all papers that went to the board because of conflicts or a conflict. Is that right?
That's correct.
What was the conflict that the provision of papers to the Postmaster Neds that would have arisen?
I think very specifically we were conscious that Postmaster Neds were first and foremost postmasters in their own right, and therefore by definition there were commercial sensitivities that may or may not have determined a particular course of action. We were making decisions with banks, with Royal Mail Group, with travel businesses, with our online business, and clearly postmasters would have been privy to particular information that might have a commercial sensitivity that may well have impacted decision-making that they could have been involved in, as in on their own accounts. And I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect, given the duality of their role as both a postmaster and an entrepreneur running their own business, as well as determining and deciding what the direction of travel for the post office is, that they would be privy to certain information that might have put them in an advantageous place, or indeed in conflict with the organisation.
Was a similar approach taken to the UKGI NED? Because they had a duality of role, didn't
Yes, they did, but they don't have a financial interest per se in the operation of their post offices, as the postmasters themselves do.
No, they have a different dual role.
They have a different role, yes, clearly.
Was it information and papers kept from them?
Well, I'd probably put it in a slightly different way. As we saw, I think it was yesterday, we saw, indeed in Project Pineapple, information that was shared with the non-executive directors by Henry was not shared with myself and Lorna. So there was a very evident illustration of that point. I, for instance, don't get the documents that go to Remco, because clearly there would be potentially a conflict for me in that documentation. So I don't think it's wholly unusual to identify conflicts where people may or may not have interests in the workings of the organisation. So I didn't see that as a particular issue.
How did it affect, if any, their role, the Postmaster Ned's role on the board, by the non-provision of papers and information?
Difficult for me to answer that, in the sense that you would have to ask Elliott and Saf what they felt that they were being excluded from. My sense is that it was very little and very limited in terms of what they were excluded from. If I think back over the last 3 years where we have been in a board meeting where either they've had to excuse themselves or leave the room because of conflict, I genuinely wouldn't be able to identify any specific issue, any specific time.
You tell us in the same statement, it's paragraph 98, that both the current Postmaster Neds were consulted on how to approach the next round of NED recruitment. And based on their input, the criteria for the role have been rebalanced and made more objective and clearer. What was unbalanced and or unobjective about the previous criteria?
I think what we've learnt, sort of specifically in terms of the first term that the Postmaster non-executive directors have done, is that there are ways to improve both the process of recruitment, both the expectations of the role, both the level of training and support that we can provide. So there were a range of different issues that we wanted to improve, and it was those that we discussed with Saf and with Elliott. How does the selection process work? What are the expectations of the role? So, for instance, we've talked quite extensively here about the commitment that the non-executive directors, the NEDs, have made. So I don't think it was anything particularly specific. It was about refining and getting their view on how the job and how the role could be done better. And I think that's what we've taken forward.
Both of them, I'll give the cross-references, no need to display. Mr. Jacobs, WITN 111800100, paragraph 14, and Mr. Ismail, 111700100, at paragraph 150, say in their written evidence, and they've repeated it in their oral evidence, that the amended criteria mean that they have not been shortlisted for reappointment when they applied to stand again. Is that right? The change in criteria meant that they were not shortlisted when they applied to stand again?
I wasn't aware that it was a change in criteria that stopped them from being shortlisted. I haven't seen the analysis of all the participants who've come forward to put their names forward. That's obviously something that's managed and run by the company secretary, and the nominations committee will be the individuals that determine what the criteria is for the selection process. So that's obviously not a committee that I sit on.
Mr. Ismail says in his statement, same reference, paragraph 151, quote, "I believe the timing and criteria were engineered to exclude me and Mr. Jacobs because we are too challenging, too inquisitive, and ask too many awkward questions." Is that right?
I don't believe that's right.
They gave interviews to the press, that's right, isn't it? And I think you refer to one of the articles based on what they had said in your witness statement, a Times article in February 2024.
I think that was an article that you presented to me as opposed to my presenting to you.
Yes.
You see what I mean? Yes.
You mentioned it
I
in your
responded.
witness
I responded to it. Yes.
Yes. And so what would you say to the suggestion that they were too challenging, too inquisitive, and asked too many awkward questions?
I'd say that was their job. I made it very clear yesterday that I championed postmaster non-executives to be on the board for exactly that reason. I knew that they would bring a tactical focus and an operational focus and an understanding of what was going on in the business at the time. It would be uncomfortable at times, and I was very aware that that would be the case. I had experienced it at NISA. I knew what I was letting myself in for, and I think certainly my own expectation was that it would bring the board closer to postmaster issues, and it would bring the board closer to what is going on from a trading perspective as well as from a cultural perspective in the organisation. And that was an important way of trying to rebuild trust. That was the ultimate aim of the objective, as well as getting their unique experiences of being a postmaster in the organisation around the boardroom table.
What would you say to the suggestion that Post Office did not listen to the postmaster non-executive directors, marginalised them after it had appointed them? They got frustrated and went to the press, and Post Office therefore made it difficult for them to effectively stand for re-election by amending the criteria.
I disagree with that. I absolutely refute that allegation.
I think it's right that exit interviews were conducted with non-executive directors. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can we look, please, at poll 00448681? NED exit interviews written summary conducted by Ernst & Young, EY.
Yes, that's correct.
And if we go, please, to page 5, please. I just want to look at some of the things that were suggested. Top line, I found it a challenge being on the Post Office board. It can feel like a puppet board where we don't have real decision-making powers while actually having a lot of responsibility. And then further down, just under the line, in answer to the question, what are the issues facing Post Office that will likely consume the time of incoming NEDs, answer that they will be coming into a board that's actually not that influential as a whole. It really has no authority. It just really rubber stamps decisions made elsewhere. And then over the page to page 6, please. And just at the bottom on the page that's being displayed at the moment, 2 paragraphs up, the GE use the board to rubber stamp things but don't involve the board as they might. I'm not sure we're respected or valued. We're all vested. There isn't the level of trust in the GE, nor are we trusted by them. This has resulted in a lack of commitment to minuted actions. Those comments, and I realise I'm selecting
Yes.
from a large number, comes during your tenure as chief executive, doesn't it?
Yes, that's correct, although I think Carla Stent in particular, her tenure was 6 years, so
So it was partially predated it.
indeed.
Do you accept the description of the role and function of the general executive, group executive?
No, I don't think so. We have and this has been discussed, I think, quite extensively by other colleagues, the range of information that comes to the board and the issues that the board has had to grapple with over the last 4 or 5 years has been quite unique in the sense that there are just a range of priorities that are very difficult to distinguish between. And so it has been difficult to get that level of genuine decision making, I think would probably be the best way to describe it. The sort of broader challenge, I think, is around the effectiveness and independence of the board and whether or not they have the levers and the power to make the decisions that the Post Office needs. I think that is the underlying theme that is being expressed here, certainly in the first 2 or 3 bullet points that you were making. And there is a challenge around that, and that is when you read the context of the entire feedback, that is the underlying theme of why I think individuals have found that they would only stay for 1 term on the board because they felt, I think it's in the first bullet that you made, that they have an enormous amount of responsibility and accountability, but they have very limited and little decision-making powers, primarily because those decisions are either made by the shareholder, stroke UKGI, or they are difficult to influence.
And so what's described by these exiting NEDs is not your experience at all of the board?
Which particular bit?
Well, the 3 that I've read to you. It's a puppet board. We don't have any real decision-making power. The board isn't influential as a whole. It rubber stamps decisions, in fact, made by the GE, and the board rubber stamps things that are for which it isn't respected or valued.
No, I don't think I would agree with that. I think the first 2 points that you make are actually more references to the influence and shape of the board with regard to the shareholder as opposed to with regard to the group executive. I think it has been very tough, I think, for the board and the group executive, certainly at this particular juncture. But I don't think that is something that is widely experienced in terms of the group executive just expecting the board to rubber stamp issues. I think it's more the volume of work that the board was having to deal with that meant they couldn't give the level of attention to the specific issues and topics that were being brought forward. And secondly, I think the nature of the business, and I say this in my original witness statement, or my first witness statement, is that for the 5 years, certainly that I have been in the business, it has been in crisis. And so many of the decisions that have come to the board have been tactical, short-term and reactive, as opposed to long-term strategic, which you would expect from a business that was perhaps under the less under the strain that the organisation has been for the last 5 years.
I think you've had your attention drawn, that can come down, thank you, drawn to an email exchange between Lorna Grattan and Rachel Scaraballotti in October 2023. I'm not going to display it unless it's necessary in the interest of time, about the SID appointment, the SID appointment, where Lorna Grattan, expressed the view that it would be beneficial to appoint a woman to give balance to the Post Office board. Do you recall?
Yes, I do recall that. I think this is the exchange where Lorna wanted, and I shared this view, that we have an external SID appointed to the board.
Did you agree that the board lacked balance and therefore needed balance brought to it by the appointment of a woman SID, a female SID?
Yes, I think so. So Lisa and Carla and Zarin all left within the space of 4 months, and I think the board would have benefited from an additional female, perhaps a SID as well.
Other people have raised concerns about your treatment of women, and I must give you the opportunity to respond to the suggestions that have been made. I'm not going to display them in the interest of time and instead summarise them for you, Mr. Reid. Firstly, Mr. Staunton claiming in March 2024 that you had overseen a culture of misogyny. Mr. Staunton saying that he was aware during his time at the post office of a high level of unhappiness amongst a number of the company's senior women. A pattern developing where senior women were not supported in challenging roles. Miss Davis telling him that she had raised the issue of the psychological safety of women in the organisation directly with you, but you were not prepared to take any action. Mr. Staunton noting that Miss Davis was the 5th Chief People Officer during your tenure, which gave him concern about your ability to retain female talent, she having expressed concerns over a job for the boys mentality within your team. And Miss Davis's Speak Up report of September 2023, which included allegations against you, which was subsequently independently investigated by Marianne Tootin, Devereux Chambers. Firstly, did you become aware of concerns regarding your views and approach to women in senior roles in Post Office?
Did I become aware?
Yes.
In what? Well, I became aware when Ms. Davis, having left the organisation in June 2023, in September 2023, elected to bring a series of grievances against me and against Henry Staunton and against the Post Office more generally, having not had her job role and her probation period converted into a permanent role. And so, having left the organisation in June, it was then some 2.5 months later that she made a series of allegations against me and including Henry.
Was that the first time that you became aware of concerns regarding views and approach towards women in Post Office?
It was the first time that I was aware that allegations had been suggested that I was fostering a culture of misogyny or anything along those lines.
When you joined the Post Office, were you concerned about any lack of diversity amongst the senior executive team or the board?
Not at the board. I think we were a diverse and functioning board. I think it was relatively well known that the group executive was male-dominated, certainly, and we were keen to set ourselves some targets for the senior leadership group and also for the group executive to introduce some diversity to both of those two forums.
You tell us in your witness statement, no need to turn it up, it's the second witness statement, page 17, paragraph 49, that a survey conducted by Post Office showed that the proportion of women experiencing comments that felt offensive, embarrassing or hurtful was greater than men, and that rose significantly and consistently with seniority. Following the results of that survey, what steps were taken, if any, to address it?
We had an action plan. 3 things emerged, I think, from that survey in particular, if it's the one that I recall. The first one was that disabled colleagues within the business were suggesting that they didn't have the opportunity to get on in the same way and weren't supported in the way that some of their abled colleagues were. We had an issue, a cultural issue, in that some of our cultural minority colleagues felt that they were not getting the level of promotion that they wanted and warranted. And then the third piece, which quite rightly you highlight, which was very, very disappointing and very unsurprising to a degree, was that senior women within the organisation had experienced more unwanted comments than their male counterparts. And so we established those three as the core equity, diversity and inclusion elements to our strategy, and we advised the organisation that that is where we were going to spend our time. We have recruited a new capability and inclusion director, and also a new equity, diversity and inclusion director to spearhead the strategy, our EDI strategy that we want to develop. So we are very conscious of that feedback and have been very transparent in the fact that this is something that we will be addressing over the next few months.
One miscellaneous topic before I ask my final questions to you. Can we look, please, at poll 0044 8381? This is a letter you'll be familiar with. It's your letter to the Lord Chancellor. 9th of January 2024. You're familiar with this?
I am indeed, that's right.
And I'm therefore going to skip over the first three paragraphs. If we scroll down, please. That refers to some work that's been done by external legal advisors, which had identified 30 potential appellants to whom Pol would write, because it would be highly likely that Pol would concede their appeals in the Court of Appeal. The letter continues, a natural corollary of that exercise has been to identify those cases in which, on the information available to us and following the judgment in Hamilton, we would be bound to oppose an appeal. Typically, these cases involve convictions obtained by reliance on evidence unrelated to the Horizon computer system. The number of such cases is very much more significant, 369 with 11 under review, another 132 in which we cannot determine the sufficiency of evidence without more information. This clearly raises acute political, judicial and communications challenges against a very significant public and parliamentary pressure for some form of acceleration or bypassing of the normal appeals process. Was this essentially you on behalf of the Post Office saying to the government that it should not legislate in an exoneration bill or similar because of an assessment that by Post Office that the vast majority of convicted sub-postmasters were, on its assessment, unlikely to have their convictions quashed in a court?
No, I was making no valid judgment, as I said in the fifth paragraph, about what this meant or what you could interpret it from it. I was extremely conscious that we discussed with the advisory board through the previous autumn, actually in the summer, the real challenge that we had in light of Hamilton of encouraging postmaster victims to come forward. We discussed a range of different ways to try and achieve this, and it was really to highlight that we felt we had an obligation. I was advised that we had an obligation to let the Lord Chancellor become aware of the fact that we'd done this work, that we had shared it with the advisory board, that we recognised there were challenges, and clearly it was important that we made ourselves, Peters and Peters, Simon Baker, Jacqueline Carey, the cases that had conducted the work on our behalf, made them aware of what we had done and the challenges that we'd experienced. You
tell us that the board held over 60 meetings regarding the Post Office's responses to the CCRC and criminal appeals just in the period 2021 and 2022. Has the Post Office similarly engaged with or held meetings in respect of its response to the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission and the Procurator Fiscal Service in Scotland?
No, we haven't.
And why is that?
I think when we first met in 2021 and went through a series of board meetings to look at individual cases, we hadn't established our remediation committee, which is the subcommittee of the board that now oversees remediation matters. And my understanding is that the remediation committee are overseeing those matters as opposed to the full board.
In May 2024, the Lord Advocate made a statement to the Scottish Parliament that due to its conduct, the Post Office was no longer trusted in Scotland and as such had been stripped of its role as a specialist reporting agency in Scotland. But what was the Post Office's response to that?
I'm not sure we had a formal response per se at the board, and I don't recall that happening. I think we had and have been very clear that we will not be conducting any form of prosecution, so I don't think it was of enormous surprise that that was the decision that was made, but it wasn't a formal discussion, certainly at the board. It may well have been something that was considered at the remediation committee.
Has the Post Office carried out any formal review of its previous performance in the role of a specialist reporting agency in Scotland?
Not that I'm aware of.
Lastly, on this topic, can we turn up poll 0044 8701? And if we just look at the last page, please. This is a letter from Mr. Vamos, partner and head of business crime. And if we just scroll down, we can see it's sent for and on behalf of Peters & Peters solicitors. And if we go back to the first page, please. This was a letter that I think was displayed on the Post Office's website.
Yes, I understand that, yes.
Do you know how that came about?
How it was put on the website? No, I don't, but I've learnt during the course of this inquiry that was the case.
And then it was taken down?
Quite possibly, yeah.
Yes. Do you know
I don't know
anything about why it was put on the Post Office's website and then it was taken down?
I don't. No, I can't give you that.
Do you know who instructed Mr. Vamos, if anyone, to write this?
No, I understand it was unsolicited, as in it came to us unsolicited.
So it's a Post Office criminal lawyer,
Yes.
somebody instructed, expert in the criminal law, writing to their client uninvited, or
Yes.
unsolicited, or
Yes.
uninstructed
Yes.
to do that, is your understanding?
That's my understanding.
But then it's put on the Post Office's website.
So I've now subsequently discovered, yes.
In the second paragraph, sorry, it's the third paragraph, the third on the page here, the second substantive paragraph. Mr. Vamos says, in reality, it's highly likely that the vast majority of people who have not yet appealed were in fact guilty as charged and were safely convicted. By posting this on the Post Office website, did the Post Office ally itself to that view?
I don't know the detail of how and why it was posted to the website. I think there is a question that we've got to ask ourselves as to the governance of what it is we put on our website and how material goes onto the website. I think that's something that we've got to review.
Was that the view within the General Executive?
No, I don't believe that is the case.
So looking at the matter generally and standing back, do you know how it is that Post Office's principal criminal lawyer wrote an unsolicited opinion for the Post Office which said that the vast majority of people who haven't appealed were as guilty as charged and safely convicted, and the Post Office publishes that?
It looks pretty appalling.
And I'm just asking, do you know how it happened?
No, I don't. I don't know the genesis, as you say, of the letter itself, or indeed how it then and who determined that it would be put onto the website.
It's addressed to dear all. Who are the all, Mr. Reid?
I don't know, sir. I don't know who all is. I'm not clear if this was communication that went more broadly to other people. I'm not certain.
I mean, normally, if it's sent by electronically, we get a kind of list of recipients on email, don't we? Unless I'm wrong, I don't think the inquiry knows to whom it was actually sent.
We can obviously find out who that is and obviously help the inquiry if that would make sense.
Thank you.
Lastly, you have heard, I think, a series of witnesses in the inquiry within this phase suggest that your personal grievances about your own remuneration became too significant a feature in your tenure and interfered with your ability to carry out your role.
Yes, I've heard that.
Are they right?
No, I don't believe that to be the case. However, I'm very aware that the furore around my pay and remuneration, and I'm not in any way deaf to that, looks very poor in light of many of the victims who are still waiting for their compensation. And I very much regret that the furore that has exploded as a consequence of that has been a distraction for everybody.
To be clear, I'm not asking you questions about whether you thought you were underpaid or not, and nor am I asking you questions about your reflections on how it looks that you were complaining repeatedly about your pay, your salary, and your remuneration package as a whole. I'm asking you, did your repeated grievances and complaints about remuneration become too significant a feature of your tenure and interfere with your ability to carry out your role?
No, I don't believe that to be the case.
And why?
I was frustrated at times, but I don't believe that it was a distraction. I'm sure if you discuss with other colleagues, they would certainly corroborate the fact that it's not something that I was perpetually discussing. There's no question that two of the individuals who have made these allegations have left the organisation under somewhat of a cloud, and so I can understand that that may well be the driver behind why they have made these comments.
I mean, to be clear, it's not simply Miss Davis or Mr. Staunton, I think the two people you're referring to,
Yes.
saying this. There are contemporaneous materials with you making complaints, saying, for example, am I prepared to make a drama out of this? Yes, I am. I'm prepared to submit a formal grievance. I'm prepared to make a claim for destructive dismissal. My patience has expired.
I was frustrated.
And the like.
I was frustrated, Mr. Bear. Yes, I can confirm that that's the case. But I think many CEOs and many individuals operating potentially in a role that, as I described on Wednesday, bears no relation to the one that I was recruited to do, and the complexity and the leadership challenges associated with that role 3 years in clearly was something that was frustrating me, and I vented that frustration.
You sought legal advice on your position.
Support, well, no, it wasn't specifically legal advice. I did obviously discuss it with other colleagues and friends, not colleagues within the business, but other colleagues.
You sought PR advice.
As I say, with other colleagues and friends. So.
I'm thinking of I'm not going to go to the text messages that you exchanged with Ms Davis, but in one of them you said, I've gained advice on my legal position and PR advice on how I intend to handle this. Did you threaten to resign as CEO unless you were given higher remuneration?
No, as I say, I was very frustrated at that particular time, but I'm still very much in role now, so I didn't offer my resignation or tender my resignation or anything of that nature.
Mr. Reid, those are my questions. Thank you very much for answering them. So we've now got questions from four call participants, starting with Mr. Steen for about an hour, then Mr. Maloney for about 45 minutes, then questions by Ms. Allen for about 10 minutes, and then questions on behalf of the NFSP for about 15 minutes. So over to Mr. Steen for about an hour.
And when you say for about an hour, we've been going about 3/4 of an hour. So that would be a fairly long session. Can we just confirm that the shorthand, the transcriber is happy with that, or will Mr. Steen need to take a break at some point?
I've already spoken to Mr. Steen about it and said that he should take a break at 11:30, or about 11:30 when a convenient moment arrives, so that the shorthand writer gets her usual break.
Thank you.
And sir, I can confirm I've spoken to Mr. Jacobs, who will remind me to take that break at around that time in about 25 minutes.
Thank you.
Mr. Reid, I think you're aware that I represent a large group of sub-postmasters. I just want to break that down so that you've got an understanding of who it is that's within that group. The large group that I represent includes people from the GLOW claimants at the High Court. It includes people that have been convicted of offences by the Post Office or thereafter, once the Post Office stopped prosecuting people itself. It includes people that were branch managers, such as Peter Holmes, deceased, represented by Marion Holmes, who appears in this inquiry and sits behind me today. It includes people that were working in branches, Miss Falcon, who was one of the last people convicted using Horizon data, who was an employed person working within a branch. It includes people like Dr. Linnell, a forensic accountant, who in fact was not a sub-postmaster working in a branch, but has devoted a considerable amount of her time and her partner's time in supporting postmasters. And it includes, importantly, the families of those people, although we don't in a legal sense represent. We support and we try and we speak to whenever we can. This is a large group of people, a broad church of people. Do you understand that?
I understand.
And the final small group of people we represent are current postmasters. So that is the direction of travel that we take in relation to the questions I'm asking you today, Mr. Reid. Mr. Reid, shortfall money. Where has the money gone, Mr. Reid?
As you've heard in this inquiry on a number of occasions, there have been external forensic accountants looking at this particular problem, trying to assess what it is that has gone and where it has gone to. The current piece of work on this topic has identified a figure somewhere in the region of £36 million between 1999 and 2015. The work itself was conducted mainly on an assessment of the HSS and the OC schemes in terms of who has projected what by way of losses. The challenge, of course, is that monies that have been repaid into or through suspense accounts and the like could easily have been customer money, client money, as opposed to necessarily specifically post office money. And so the proportion that goes straight to the bottom line, for want of a better word, within the post office can be quite obscured. I guess what I'm trying to say is we think we have got a figure of somewhere in the region of 36 million spread across those years. I don't think it is as definitive as we would like it to be. I think the fact that, and it is known as Project Boland within the post office, I think KPMG were the last forensic accountants to look at this problem. You'll be fully aware that data going back a number of years is extremely difficult in the post office to identify very often. And that is our best endeavour in terms of where we've got to. As I understand it is going to be reviewed again, but it is a frustration, and I appreciate it's a frustration. We've talked about this topic at the inquiry on a number of occasions.
You're right, Mr. Reid. I've raised this time and time again,
Indeed.
Witness after witness. I asked Mr. Cameron on the 17th of May 2024 the very question I asked you, where's the money gone?
Yes.
I got told by Mr. Cameron after a number of other questions. Well, I think, ask Nick Reid. He's the CEO. He said, I'm not saying that he's the one who's going to do the work, but he's the one that can marshal the resources and make it a priority and ascertain if it is possible at this time of day, he said, to go back as far to 2005 or indeed before. So these efforts to track down this money that Sir Anthony Hooper, Sir Alan Bates, Kay Linnell, Dr. Linnell, Second Sight have been going on about for so many years, over the decades. When did they first achieve a priority within the post office?
Trying to identify where the funds were. This project has been running for some time, and Mr. Cameron is very aware of it as well. Under his tenure as the CFO, clearly it fell within his remit. We reignited those in light of the conversation that you had with Alistair in May, and that's why the Project Boland has been reignited. We've been immensely frustrated. We've all been frustrated that there isn't a simple answer to this question. It's an extremely complex issue because clearly, by definition, people are paid in losses themselves and have not alerted the post office. We don't have the level of data that goes back or the accuracy of the data that goes back, and as everybody is fully aware, that is a great frustration. And as I say, this is predominantly based upon what victims of the scandal have told us through the HSS and indeed through the OC, and our attempt to try and understand from that mechanism. It isn't satisfactory.
Mr. Reid, the shortfalls, the shortfalls and the paying off of shortfalls continues. You know that the YouGov report that was commissioned by the inquiry has received consultation responses demonstrating that people are still paying off shortfalls. Do you understand that?
It's very frustrating that people
Do you understand that, Mr. Reid? It's not about your frustration. Do you know that to yourself?
I'm aware that people are paying for shortfalls. We've made it very clear that the review and dispute button and the branch support centre will help individuals to understand where discrepancies have occurred. And as I said yesterday on a number of occasions, we are not forcing individuals. There is a presumption of innocence, and it's really important that that message lands. We have struggled to engage more broadly and communicate more broadly with many postmasters, as we discussed yesterday going through the YouGov survey. But I'm very, very clear, and you can hear it from me in this forum, that we are not enforcing people to make good losses. We are suggesting that where there is an issue that they do not understand, we help them to try and understand, and if we can't understand, then we move on.
Currently, when a sub-postmaster pays off a shortfall, is it investigated? Now, be careful about the answer to this. There's the dispute button, yes?
There is a review and dispute button.
If someone presses the dispute button, review and dispute button, then it seems that the current policies mean that there's an investigation. Do you agree?
When you press the review and dispute button, it goes through to the branch support centre, and we try and work out with the postmaster what is the issue.
Right, so the answer is actually yes. You could have done that with a yes. Okay, next one. when a sub-postmaster calls the helpline and says, look, I'm having a problem with the account and trying to balance, and there seems to be a discrepancy, is that investigated? Yes or no, if you can, please, Mr. Reid.
Yes, it is.
Right. Let's look at the other type of shortfall then. So where someone does not press the review and dispute button, where someone does not phone the helpline for whatever reason, is that investigated? So a shortfall that is paid off by a sub-postmaster, which is not the subject of pressing the button and not the subject of calling the helpline, is that investigated?
If it isn't brought to the attention of the branch support centre, then it won't be investigated because we would be unaware of what had occurred.
Now, the
Unless
system
I'm
within a
misunderstanding
branch...
you.
Forgive me, Mr. Reid, you finish.
Unless I'm misunderstanding you, we would have to have the discrepancy or the loss brought to our attention for us to be able to investigate it. If people are still paying in because they have done a branch, they've done an end of day, an end of week, or a trading period reconciliation and found that they've got cash in stock that doesn't match what's on the horizon, and they're determined that they want to pay that money in, then it's very difficult, I think, as my understanding goes, for the post office to be aware of that particular situation.
When individuals within a branch account find that they have a shortfall, they're doing so based upon the data that they have, which is also on the Horizon system. Do you agree?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. So is it possible for the post office to start looking at shortfalls that occur within branches that are then paid off? So what I mean is this. Individuals who are currently paying off discrepancies that they find, that you know about through the YouGov report at least, that is still happening. Why doesn't the post office actually start to analyse the shortfalls that are occurring on their accounts?
Well, we have a discrepancy report and a shortfall report. Every single investigation that now occurs into a shortfall and or a discrepancy is recorded. So we have an impact, a branch impact sort of program, I think it's called BIP, which identifies all the shortfalls and identifies all the discrepancies, so that that database is available for anybody in the branch support centre or anybody in the support and reconciliation centre to look into to see if there is a commonality or a theme. And what we do is obviously we look at the range of discrepancies that occur and we start to address them by theme, so that those that are occurring more regularly, and we discussed this yesterday in terms of moving keys or the like, we address.
So let's go back a couple of minutes into your evidence. You agree that if the situation is that someone within a branch pays off a shortfall that they don't bring to the attention of the wider post office, maybe because they're afraid to do so, maybe it's because the history of this very scandal has affected them so that they don't feel that they can, or maybe it's because it's a smallish amount of money and they just want to keep trading without interruption. Maybe for any one of those reasons that they don't bring it that way to the attention of the post office could be monitoring this, but isn't. Do you agree?
No, I don't. I don't really understand your point, because we're very clear that if you have a discrepancy and you don't understand the genesis of that discrepancy, then you must ring the branch support centre, you must press the review and dispute button, and we will help to understand why that is the case. I'm very clear that it's a presumption of innocence here, and we will get on and support people, and we are doing considerably different work to understand the root cause of the issues and make sure we fix them. So
Mr. Reid, that's the corporate...
Maybe we're at different cross purposes here. But
No, I don't think we are, Mr. Reid. That's the corporate message that you're spouting. The corporate message is we're trying to change. We're trying to be different from what we used to be. We're trying not to browbeat the sub-postmasters. We're hoping that we're not prosecuting anybody. Those are the messages that you're essentially trying to get out, okay? But it is clear from the YouGov report that particularly long-term sub-postmasters are still paying off shortfalls. You know that, don't you, Mr. Reid?
I would be very concerned if people were paying off shortfalls that they felt were not as a consequence of an action that may have taken.
What do you mean concerned, Mr. Reid? That is essentially what the YouGov report has identified, that people are still paying off shortfalls themselves. It's not just a concern, this is happening. Do you dispute that, Mr. Reid?
No, I don't dispute
Right.
it. They need to, as I've mentioned before, get in touch with the branch support centre if they believe that the discrepancies that have been generated in branch bear no relation to activity that they have been deployed in.
Look at it from the sub-postmaster point of view.
Yes.
I'll turn at the end of my questions to what's happened through your visits as part of reparations, as part of meeting people that have been affected by the scandal. You, I know, have gone on those visits, and you have done that, and you have shown empathy, yes?
Yes.
And they've affected you. We can
Very
see
much
that.
so.
Yes. And you know that the long history of this scandal has
Yes.
affected people working in branches currently, yes?
I agree.
And you're essentially saying we're trying to change and we're trying to get that information across.
Yes.
And you understand that the YouGov report is highlighting the fact that people are still paying off using their own money.
I do.
And it's perhaps there's a trend towards it being the longer-term sub-postmasters.
I think that's fair.
And so you understand that the message that you've been trying to get across, perhaps it's not being received, perhaps it's not even welcome, that the message is a difficult one to get across.
Yes, and that was very much what I said yesterday, was that we are struggling to engage with the longer-term postmasters for the reasons that I think you have articulated very clearly.
And Mr. Reid, how much longer have you got at the post office?
To the end of March.
End of March. It's clear, I think you'll agree, that there's work to be done in this area of shortfalls.
I would agree with that.
Will you rededicate your remaining period of time, not exclusively, but at least a part of it, to working on the shortfalls, to making sure that people know and understand that they don't have to pay it off, that there is a way of sorting it out without having to use their own money? Will you do that?
I will certainly do that. More importantly, and I think what even more importantly is we're just not reaching some of the postmasters who have had long service within the post office for perhaps some of the reasons you've described, which is the level of trauma and the level of mistrust. That is of great concern to me, and that is something that we need to address.
I'm going to turn to a document that is called one of the Postmaster Support Policies, of which there are many, and it's the Postmaster Account Support Document, POL 00448 3 zeros. I'll repeat that. POL 00448 3 zeros. Now, Mr. Reid, you may have some familiarity with these documents if on the original they're bright red, as they come on the screen, that
Right.
they appear to be rather dark. And we can see that this one is version 4.0. In fact, there's a slightly later version, but they don't appear to differ. This one is Postmaster Support Policy, Postmaster Account Support. And can we go, please, to page 8 of this document? And so, for your assistance, these are documents from this year, 2024.
Yeah.
Can you scroll down to, on that page, I think it's called The Risk, the title is The Risk, which is paragraph 2.5. If we read through that, Post Office can recover losses from a postmaster when such losses are caused through negligence, carelessness or error, and Post Office has carried out a reasonable and fair investigation, as set out in the Postmaster Accounting Dispute Resolution Policy, as to the cause and reason for the loss, and whether it was properly attributed to the postmaster. Postmasters are also responsible for losses caused by their assistants. Now let's start with the last sentence. That seems to be an echo of the past, with postmasters being asked to account for the losses caused by their assistants. Is that quite right?
I think it needs further clarity in terms of what does that specifically mean. I think my interpretation of this is that the postmaster must be responsible, obviously, for the assistant, the level of training, the level of responsibility, and the conduct of the individual. I think the inference here is not quite appropriate.
No,
Yeah, it needs tightening.
Needs a bit of work, you might say, Mr. Reid. And the starting point of this part at 2.5 is Post Office can recover losses from a postmaster when such losses are caused through negligence, carelessness or error. So the system's still saying to sub-postmasters that what can happen is that we may pursue you for losses. A tenor of your evidence yesterday was that perhaps we don't do that. What do you think about this policy?
Well, I think, as we said yesterday, one of the first things that we need to do is make sure that negligence, carelessness, and or error is described very clearly, as in what does it mean? So, as an example, negligence might be leaving the safe door open during the middle of trading in a busy branch. As an example, that could be considered or deemed negligent. But I think it needs a lot more clarity in terms of what is it that these statements actually mean, and how and who is interpreting them, and what are the implications of those interpretations. So I think well, I agree with you in that sense that there's more work to be done.
I asked a whole series of questions this morning about shortfalls and people paying them off. What may be the cause of it? It's this type of messaging, which says that we may still go after you, that still exists this year within the Post Office, doesn't exactly help, does it, Mr.
The tone is inappropriate.
Can I go to a different document, please? This is a document which is another Postmaster support policy, so there are quite a few of these. This one's contract termination. And the reference is POL 00448-206. So I'll repeat that, POL 00448-206.
And are all these documents 2024, Mr. C?
They are, so I can show the dates on these things.
No. I'd assume they're all 2024 unless you tell me otherwise.
That's right, sir. You might at some stage ask the inquiry team for copies of these, but they're changing so frequently, to be fair to the Post Office, that it's difficult to identify the ones. The ones I've got, in fact, are slightly later ones than the ones that I can find on relativity.
Just for a point of help, the Postmaster support policies, I think there are 12 in total. They go through a yearly cycle of review and revision. The Risk and Compliance Committee and the Board Committee, which is the ARC Committee, which is upon which actually postmasters sit. So postmasters non-executives sit on that committee in terms of Elliot Jacobs in particular.
Can we go to paragraph 4.5, please? I'm conscious, Mr. Reid, obviously, of time, that's all.
Okay.
So it should come up as repudiatory breach. How do you say that word?
Repudiatory.
Right. Okay, 4.5, immediate termination. In fact, on the document I've got, which is slightly later, it's called, how do you say that word?
Repudiatory.
Repudiatory breach, okay? So 4.5, immediate termination. Post Office may only terminate a contract immediately without notice where, can you go over the page, please? And then, 4.6, there we go. And further down, please. So 4.6. So this is about immediate termination, okay? And these are the sorts of breaches that can cause immediate termination. 4.6, fifth bullet point down, where discrepancies of a significant value have been caused by the negligence, carelessness or error of the postmaster, resulting in a loss to Post Office and which have been fully investigated by Post Office. Okay? Mr. Reid, my suggestion is that if we follow through the documents that are in existence, that are live today, that essentially the same message is going out, even to the point of essentially saying you might be sacked without notice.
Well, I think a couple of points on that. What I'm very, very clear about is there is no termination without the Dispute Resolution Committee, upon which sit two ex-postmasters, one of which is the chair of that committee, that oversees whether or not we can dismiss or can close down an individual post office or postmaster. So we've been very explicit that we do have an independent postmaster or an ex-postmaster who sits on that committee.
Your understanding, though, from my questions is I believe that you accept that there's work that needs to be done. The tenor of these documents is still saying, essentially, we may go after you if we find that there are losses to the Post Office through Horizon shortfalls. That's still a message that's out there, Mr. Reid. Do you accept that this needs, perhaps, at the very least, a bit of rework?
I think there is some rework that needs to be done. We can agree on that, Mr. Steen.
Now, we know that in relation to shortfalls, and I quote here from the statement of Melanie Park, for those that wish to make a note, it's paragraph 97, page 46 of her statement. Her statement, for anyone's note-taking purposes, is WITN 116000100. I do not need to go to the document. Ms. Park will be giving evidence later in this query, says, however, a branch is prevented from completing the trading period end process and moving into the subsequent trading period if it has not actioned all transaction corrections, either by accepting them or using the RD function in Horizon and or has a balance remaining in the local suspense account. Now, as I understand it, what Ms. Park is going to be telling us, therefore, is that unless you sort out the shortfalls, you can't keep on going. Okay?
No, she's not going to tell you that.
Okay. We'll ask her those questions.
Yes, you can.
All right. One of the contractual requirements, and if we needed to, we can go to it in the policy documents, is that the branches, the sub-postmasters, comply with visits from the branch assurance teams.
That's correct.
Ms. Parks says about that, paragraph 55 this time, I would also like to make clear that no member of any team that might ultimately investigate a discrepancy arising from a branch assurance visit will be present during the branch assurance visit. Okay? Shall I repeat that?
Yes, please.
Or rather mangle
Yeah.
it. She's saying this. I'd also like to make clear that no member of any team that might ultimately investigate a discrepancy arising from a branch assurance visit will be present during the branch assurance visit. Okay?
That's correct.
So she's talking about essentially separations of
She is.
teams. So let's add this all up together. We've got sub-postmasters who are subject to a contractual requirement to cooperate with visits from the branch assurance team. Yes?
That's correct.
The branch assurance team may refer matters to an investigation team within the Post Office.
Yes, to the branch support and reconciliation team.
And Mr. Beer yesterday asked a number of questions about the contract and about whether the terms used within that contract, investigation teams, was appropriate. And you said yesterday, again, that needs work. You agree, and you recall that?
I do recall that.
Yeah. Then we have the policies that we've been looking at today that again need work, which appear to be saying, look, to the sub-postmasters, we may still go after you for losses. Yes? Again, all needs work.
Yes, I mean, we've got more to do. There's always
Yes.
work to be done.
From the sub-postmaster point of view, it might be said that whatever you call the branch assurance team, you could call them the Butterfly Club, Mr. Reid. It will still be seen as being part of an investigation by the Post Office into shortfalls that may lead to their contract being terminated. That is the message that comes across if you look at the system, Mr. Reid. And that's the message which I think you're saying you don't, in fact, want to come across to sub-postmasters.
I certainly don't want that message to come across to sub-postmasters. I'm also very clear that the branch assurance team do one thing and one thing only, and that's basically a stock check. They will count the stock and they will count the funds. They won't do anything else. They won't investigate anything. They have no accountabilities. They have no job role associated with anything other than a cash and stock check. If we haven't made that clear for folk, then we need to be much clearer in doing so. The other point I think that is important to make is the presumption of innocence still pervades, and that is really very important. We are here to try and resolve discrepancies, not to insist upon people making them up if they believe that not to be the case. And you touched on the importance of not being able to trade or move into the next trading period. If the review and dispute button is pressed, if there's any disagreement or misalignment associated with a discrepancy, then it gets placed into effectively a local suspense account, and you move on and you trade. And you trade the following week, and you trade the following week after that. And we will then try and resolve what the issue is. And if we can't resolve it, then we have a dispute process that we can go through. But we are not at any stage forcing people to make good losses that they do not agree with. Now, we may well have more to do in terms of our engagement and communication. We've talked about that, and I would agree that we still have pockets of postmasters who are deeply, deeply troubled by what has occurred historically, and we need to address that.
Pockets may be a slight understatement, Mr. Reid. Looking at the figures that you get through the YouGov report, you've got significant numbers of people that are still doing this. They may be doing it in £10 and £20 or £50 or £100, but they're still doing it. And those £10, £20, £50 adds up to millions as you accept over
Absolutely
years.
it does.
Your figure of 36 million is growing, Mr. Reid. Now, my time has been set. I've asked Mr. Jacobs to give me a note to say that it's break time, and it is now is break time.
Okay.
15 minutes, please, sir.
All right, certainly. So we resume at 11:30, yeah?
Thank you, sir.
Fine.
I think Mr. Steen will notice that the chairman has reappeared.
I'd like to thank Mr. Beer for pointing that out. Mr. Reid, the background to this inquiry, the background to this scandal, it's all been about the withholding by the Post Office of information that would have assisted sub-postmasters, that would have assisted people that were being investigated, that would have assisted people that were going through the criminal courts or the civil courts or through audits. That's the background. Do you understand that from the horizon?
Yes, of course.
If I call them the Fraser judgments.
Yes, of course.
I hope Lord Justice Fraser will forgive me.
Yes.
Have you ever kept back information that would assist in the investigation of matters either through criminal courts or through audits?
No.
No? Because you no doubt understand the ramifications of doing such.
That's correct.
Yet we know that Mr. Patterson wrote a letter. Mr. Patterson, I think, who's the European director of Fujitsu, worldwide company, wrote a letter on the 17th of May of this year saying that Fujitsu will not support or any pursuit of any enforcement action, civil or criminal, against sub-postmasters. And it was a pretty clear letter, finishing with the line, it should not be relying on Horizon data as a basis for such shortfall enforcement. Okay? Now, you went through this correspondence with Mr. Beer, and I won't redo that. So we know that there was further communication between yourself and Mr. Patterson. All right. And we know that Mr. Railton gave evidence and says that he's going to take up this particular cudgel or this particular stream of correspondence with Mr. Patterson, and he's going to attempt to deal with it as well. All right? You recall that yesterday, Mr. Beer was asking you questions about a meeting of the SEG, that's the Strategic Executive Group. That was a meeting on the Wednesday, 26th of June 2024, starting at 11 a.m. And it was a discussion document that put forward by Ms. Gray and Mr. Bartlett, which was disclosure to support police investigations. You recall that?
I do recall that.
Now, let's ask the specific question. Had you, by the 26th of June 2024, disclosed to Ms. Gray and Mr. Bartlett the correspondence that you received from Mr. Patterson on the 17th of May 2024?
Yes, she was aware of it, yes.
Had it gone to the board?
As I said yesterday, it was discussed with Mr. Tidswell, who was the acting chair at the time, and with Lorna Gretton, who, as you know, is the shareholder representative. I don't think the full board had seen it. It was, as I say at the time, it was correspondence between two CEOs as opposed to a board-level decision.
Now, Mr. Relson gave evidence saying that he had seen this correspondence as part of his pack, his evidence pack, before giving evidence. He clearly hadn't seen this document and this correspondence that you'd had with Mr. Patterson at Fujitsu. How come the new chair of the Post Office hadn't been told about the correspondence with Mr. Patterson where the Fujitsu company supporting, creating essentially and running the Horizon system is saying, don't use our data. How come that hadn't got to Mr. Railton?
I don't think we saw the engagement with Mr. Patterson in quite the same way as you have, and I think the point that I was trying to explain to Mr. Beer and to Sir Wynne was that this was more of a spat than anything else. I don't believe that it was the degree that you're suggesting here and now. I think we were quite affronted, obviously, by the communication that we received from Mr. Patterson, and that was something that Owen Woodley and Neil Brocklehurst have continued to take on over the summer.
That's not actually the answer to my question. How come Mr. Railton hadn't seen the document until he had it from the inquiry in his evidence pack before he gave evidence?
I don't know.
Because Mr. Railton's evidence by that point is that he's coming in, he's suggesting that there's going to be a turnaround of this particular ship, and it's going to be to rework the entire post office in relation to the questions that concern sub-postmasters. A good phrase he used. He's going to reverse the polarity of the post office. So it's postmaster-centric rather than the other way round, rather than executive-centric, is the way I understand it. He's also looking into the question of the Horizon system and whether NBIT should go ahead, whether it should be replaced. It seems that it should have been information that should have gone to Mr. Railton, and you don't know how it was missed.
Quite possibly.
Now, you've explained in one of your answers, just given, that, well, you thought this was a bit of a spat, that was your word. A spat between, and then you go on to say, however it came about, maybe between two CEOs. Did you, regarding that correspondence, take advice from a criminal lawyer?
I took advice from my general counsel.
That's not the answer to my question, unless general counsel turns out to be a criminal lawyer.
It could possibly be that her training is in criminal law. I'm not sure.
Right. Did you purposefully decide, well, this is something that has a relevance to investigations. This is something that may be important to what's going on with the police, which you're learning about through the SEG meeting on the 26th of June. Did you decide, I better run this by a criminal lawyer?
No, I didn't decide that at all. I decided that I would take the guidance of my interim chair, who is as a lawyer, and also the general counsel, and the shareholder representative, and describe what it was that I was communicating with Mr. Patterson.
Did you take advice on this document from Ms. Gallifant, King's Counsel? I don't ask for what the content of that advice was. I ask you whether you went to her. Ms. Gallifant, Nicola Greeny, King's Counsel, Simon Baker, King's Counsel. They are all King's Counsel instructed by the Post Office and dealing with different aspects of this inquiry. Did you go to them?
I don't.
Saying, I've had this letter from Mr. Patterson at Fujitsu. It concerns me about disclosure. What should we do with it, or something similar?
I don't know whether the email trails have been disclosed in their entirety, but they may well have been. And therefore, what guidance that General Counsel took, I can't tell you that.
And when you get to the June meeting, which is the SEG meeting, which is a meeting that is discussing the question of disclosure to support police investigations, when a document is being put forward in relation to that, did you or anyone around you say to themselves, we better have a word with those police investigations and make sure that they're aware of this correspondence?
No, I don't believe we did that. I think
I go back to my question. Have you been involved in the withholding of information that may be relevant to investigations that are
No,
ongoing?
I haven't.
Well, it seems that your answer is a yes, Mr. Steen. I have.
Well, I don't believe that to be the case, Mr. Steen.
Now, there are things called entrustment requirements that are set by government in relation to the operation of the Post Office. You agree?
Services of general economic interest.
Yeah. So the Post Office has a wider community service aspect that is the subject of extra funding from government.
Very much so.
And just describing one of those by way of example. Nationally, 99% of the UK population to be within 3 miles and 90% of the population to be within 1 mile of their nearest post office outlet. Yes?
That sounds
Right.
Correct.
So using those as my example in relation to the requirement set, we know that there is, if you like, there is this outreach by the Post Office that is directed into communities whereby it might not be economically sensible to open up a post office if you want to make money.
That's correct.
And the government provides essentially compensation, which I think is the word used, to the post office to allow the support for such branches. Do you agree?
The expression I used was subsidy.
Fine. Now, in your statement, you refer to a review by the government to undertake a review of its policy for the post office. And you refer to a letter from Mr. Kwarteng, member of the Parliament, I can't remember whether he's still elected or not, who was then the Secretary of State for BEIS, dated the 11th of March 2022. Can we go to that letter, please? It is POL 00448-435. That's POL 00448-435. Thank you. So we see the date of this letter. We see who it's from, the Secretary of State, Department for Business, as it was then called. And we see the recipients. It's yourself and Mr. Parker. The date is 11th of March 22. Now, some of this letter, in fact, confirms the commitment to the requirements, essentially that the government is asking the Post Office to continue to commit to those requirements. All right?
To the SGEIs, yes.
I'm very grateful. So the particular part I'd like to refer to then is not so much that, but at the bottom of page 2 and top of page 3, please. Thank you. So keeping in our minds the date, the 11th of March 2022, we've got this. Future policy framework for the Post Office. Finally, I recognise the need to consider the policy framework in the context of the changes to the wider environment and the new challenges you face on top of COVID-19 and ongoing work to resolve historical matters. It is crucial we develop a sustainable long-term approach for the network, and I look forward to working with you on this review. Okay?
Yes.
Now, that appears to be, from what I understand, the review you're referring to in your statement, which was requested by the Post Office.
Looks like it, yes.
It does. Now, we're now getting close to the end of 2024, and we learn from Mr. Relton that the Post Office is in fact saying to government, look, government, Post Office needs your long-term commitment for long-term support. It needs money to be able to provide a new system, IT system, to continue operation. That's happening now. That seems to be what Mr. Relton is saying since he's come in. Why has it taken so long, Mr. Reid, for anyone to think about the result of this sort of review back in 22? Why has it taken so long, Mr. Reid?
I'm not entirely sure I'm clear with your point. The government's policy review is for the government to initiate. We pushed the government in 21 to initiate this policy review on the back of a strategic review that we did ourselves in 2019-2020. So I'm not entirely clear on your point, other than, as I made the point yesterday, the policy team within the department has been very focused on compensation. I think it would be fair to say that their resources have been split between doing compensation and initiating a policy review. I'm as frustrated as anyone that we don't have a policy review from the government that we can build around, and I express this quite clearly.
You may get the direction of my travel wrong. Not an attack upon the Post Office necessarily. Why has it taken so long for government to actually start thinking about the strategic direction of the Post Office in terms of the way that Mr. Relton was talking about, the funding commitment, the long-term funding commitment? Why has it taken government so long to wake up?
I think you'll need to address those questions to government.
Mr. Reid, you've been in post now for 5 years.
Yeah.
Tell us what you think's been happening with government. Why has there been a government failure to essentially support the sub-postmasters to make sure that they understand that there is a long-term life for the Post Office? Or why don't you sell it off to Amazon, as Sir Alan suggests?
I think, looking back to the comments that Henry Staunton made when he was in front of this inquiry, there was a determination to get through to the election, and then from the election to reset the post office. And I think that was certainly the direction of travel that was indicated by the Permanent Secretary 18 months ago. So I think that is probably the underlying driver behind this. I'm very confident that Mr. Railton's enthusiasm and sense of purpose is going to drive the government hard on this, and he made that point very clearly earlier in the week. And I fully expect that the government will obviously get hold of the strategic review, and I hope that they will dovetail that in, as we discussed yesterday, to their own policy review, and that we come up with a sustainable strategy, long-term sustainable strategy for the post office. Mr. Railton implied on Tuesday that that would be in the next 2 or 3 weeks that the department would respond to that, and I look forward to hearing
See,
what
that evidence from Mr. Railton was remarkably tight to the timing of his evidence, and indeed yours. So it seems that just before he was giving evidence that something was done. Was it a letter that was sent to government saying that you need a commitment from government to full funding? Who compiled the document that was sent to government? Was it another organisation? Was it the post office working with another organisation? Where did this impetus come from just before giving evidence, Mr. Railton?
Mr. Railton has been very clear that the terms of taking on the chairmanship of the post office was that we would do a strategic review. He was very clear about that, and that was part and parcel with his signing up to be the interim chairman. As a consequence of that commitment from the government, he engaged with Teneo to do a full strategic review of the organisation. They said it would take 4 months. The conclusion of that 4 months is literally about now. So the timing is not unique in that sense. It's exactly what was laid out in the Teneo work that started back in June.
So the timing and the question of the timing relates to Mr. Railton's appointment.
Correct.
Since he's come in, he's provided that extra impetus, essentially to rattle the government cage, to say what's going on for the future of the post office.
Yes.
And what you can't say is why it's taken so long for the government to actually come up with anything itself to guarantee the long-term work of the post office. You don't know the answer.
As I say, I think the policy team has been very focused on driving compensation, and that is why they have not taken the policy review forward in the way that I'd articulated yesterday and the day before, which was the first time we would have had a policy review since 2010.
Right. Well, we've got some government witnesses coming along and past ministers. So I look forward to asking them questions about that. Now, we've had various references to strategic plans. We've had various references to chief people officers and reviews that relate to outside organisations drafting up something that comes back with corporate speak saying that everyone needs to be nice to each other and everyone needs to remember that there are other people working in a collegiate way within the organisation. Now, I don't in any way seek to undermine the value of such documents. It is important that people working within an organisation do in fact respect each other and do trust each other. These are fundamental to any organisation. But one of the matters that was marked out, and I asked questions of Miss Kewen about these documents, they don't mention sub-postmasters. There were 2 documents I asked her about, the people plan and then the behaviours plan, clearly directed at internal employees. How come under your watch, Mr. Reid, that there's been the production of these sorts of documents that don't refer to sub-postmasters in the way that, frankly, you would expect after all of this scandal? How come, Mr. Reid?
I think, as Ms. McKeown referenced, you were talking specifically about behaviours and about the importance of how the post office internally transformed its behaviours. And I think that was and remains a very valid and important part of the work that we need to do to develop our ways of working and to develop our behaviours. The explicit reference or the explicit inclusion of the postmasters, I can understand the concern, if that's the right word, of you and your clients. The objective of the people plan, the strategic people plan, was very much to shift the culture internally such that it was supporting postmasters. It isn't our place to, and certainly isn't my place, to instruct postmasters on how we behave. I think it is our place to communicate to postmasters what we're trying to achieve, and that's what we will be doing through our behaviours document and through our ways of working documents.
I've asked you questions about shortfalls, about the policy documents.
Yes.
You agree that they need review. I'm now asking you questions about these sorts of people plans and the fact that they miss out reference to the sub-postmasters. There still appears to be a trend within the Post Office to miss out sub-postmasters as being a group that the Post Office is in fact dedicated towards. Will you again, in the remaining months of your period of time at the Post Office, review these sorts of documents? Ask the people within the Post Office, why aren't we referring to sub-postmasters where we should be? Again, will you deal with that?
I will.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Relton's evidence was something that was set out so that we understand and we wait the result of the review and the discussions with government, whereby there's going to be this recommitment, rededication of the sub-postmaster, of the Post Office towards sub-postmasters. We have messages from people we represent who are current sub-postmasters to say that they're not feeling the love, Mr. Reid. Let me read one. As a person who is still working behind the Post Office counter, acting postmaster at the same branch, that Post Office broke me as an individual. We have had no sight of any increase but only decrease, to say if we do not meet certain targets on services, we will lose them. That's all we've had. I'd be extremely concerned of what the Post Office has to offer in this new strategy, the one that's being discussed by Mr. Relton, as I'm sure it's only going to be in benefit for Post Office Limited and the staff that actually work for Post Office rather than the people on the actual ground who earn them the money and pay their wages while we get the crumbs. The message goes on to say, I've definitely pushed for this plan to have been seen before government agree, as these people are only pencil pushers sitting behind a desk with a massive income. They have no idea of the struggles we have on the ground. So people in branches are not feeling the love, Mr. Reid. And there are still plans, as we learnt from the current chair of the NFSP, West Linton branch, to close. These are hard-to-place branches. Surely, if there is this root and branch review that is ongoing to discuss the future of the Post Office, with a change of polarity for the Post Office to re-centre itself towards sub-postmasters, surely all of these closures, these branch closures, should stop. Surely there should be a moratorium on actions taken in relation to sub-postmasters. Draw a line, Mr. Reid, to say, if we're going to be changing, let's make sure that the sub-postmasters understand there's going to be a change. What do you think, Mr. Reid?
Well, I think Mr. Relton made it very clear yesterday, on Tuesday, that at the core of the strategic review is the relationship with postmasters, but a new deal, I think was the expression he used for postmasters. And a new deal is absolutely central to moving forward. We've talked about that over the last 3 days. I don't recognise your closing of branches notion. It's not something that we have been doing recently, so I don't follow that particular train of thought. We're not seeing churn numbers as dramatic as might be implied, and indeed the stability of the network and the desire of people to open branches is, frankly, given the last 9 months, surprisingly robust. Notwithstanding what you're saying, Nigel's commitment to a new deal for postmasters, his words, polarity, I think we've tried, and this is the next phase of that. We have been engaging, and I know that Nigel made that point with the NFSP and with the Voice of the Postmaster and with other postmaster groups to discuss the issues that they think need to be addressed so that we can bring those into our strategic review, and that's absolutely what has been done and is ongoing.
So, Mr. Reid, what it appears to be is that there is a considerable and too far distance between the office of the CEO, probably the board as well, and the individual sub-postmasters working perhaps in small branches in small or low-density population areas. That's what it appears to be, that this message that you keep on wanting to say, understand why, and must get out, it is not getting out. We've seen that from the YouGov report. We see it from such correspondence. You need to close that distance. You need to make sure that the communication is effective. Do you accept that?
Well, as I said, we do need to get closer to it.
Let me turn then to the schemes, the compensation schemes. I'm just going to describe what they are to make sure that we've got the sheer number of them. There is the group litigation scheme, the GLO scheme. That one's run by the Department for Business and Trade. There is the Horizons Convictions Redress Scheme, which the Department for Business and Trade is also administering, which deals with redress for people whose criminal convictions are overturned by legislation. Yes?
Correct.
There is the Overturned Conviction Scheme. The Post Office runs this one, dealing with redress for people whose Horizon-related criminal convictions have been overturned by the courts. Yes?
That's correct.
There is the Horizon Shortfall Scheme. Post Office is administering that one, administering the Horizon Shortfalls that was established in 2020 to provide redress for postmasters who were not claimants in the group litigation.
That's correct.
Okay, so 2 schemes being run by the Department of Business and Trade and 2 being run by the Post Office.
That's correct.
Okay. In addition to that, we also have a suspension remuneration review being run by the Post Office. Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
That's for those individuals who have been essentially highlighted by Lord Justice Fraser's judgments, those people that have been suspended whilst investigations are carried on, and its redress being considered in relation to those suspensions. Is that correct?
That is correct.
There is also an adequacy of payments under the shortfall scheme, a review of the shortfall scheme payments, because it is being considered that some payments were inadequate. Do you agree?
That's correct.
And then, unless you're going to tell me there's another one, there is a stamp compensation scheme that is ongoing as well. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So the evidence in relation to stamps was given, I think, by the NEDs in part. That was because another debacle committed by the Post Office was in relation to stamps, how it was dealt with and interference in branch accounts. Have I missed any schemes?
Yes, there are other schemes.
Right. Are they schemes that are dealing with financial redress to individuals?
That's correct.
So what are they?
There is a process scheme that is currently in pilot as well at the moment, and there are, I don't recall off the top
Help
of my
us and understand what a process scheme means.
Well, again, it's a pilot to try and understand if there are other areas of discrepancy that people have come forward and said we have areas where we think there may be detriment. So we're looking at all of those. We want to be very open and transparent, and if there are people who come forward and say that they have experienced some form of detriment, we want to make sure that we are addressing it head on.
Let me give you an example of the experience of one individual we represent. It's Mr. Peter Worsfield. He's finally had his offer on his GLO scheme claim last week. Across multiple heads of loss, he's been offered only 70% of what he claimed. And the reason that he's been given, and I quote, is evidential uncertainty as a result of gaps within the supporting evidence provided. Okay? Now, in the questions being asked yesterday by Mr. Beer, he took you to a document whereby one of the ministers at the department was concerned about the question of evidential support and essentially saying, that's Mr. Hollenrake, that give the people benefit of the doubt in relation to evidence. Do you, Mr. Reid, believe that sub-postmaster claimants should be given the benefit of the doubt across all schemes?
I don't have the detail to be able to comment across all schemes, but I've been very clear that the evidential bar must remain low and the evidential bar must be such that the benefit of the doubt is for postmasters. And I've been very clear about that. I've said that here in this inquiry, and I do believe that, and that is exactly what should happen.
It needs to be believed, doesn't it, Mr. Reid? I'm butting in because of something you said earlier in your evidence. You were explaining about the real difficulties for the Post Office in looking at shortfalls because of the amount of time it goes back through into the early 2000s. And indeed, there are questions being asked about another electronic scheme called Capture, so it may go even earlier than that. Those evidential difficulties in trying to analyse shortfalls are the same sorts of problems that some people are also experiencing that trying to get their way through these schemes. So it's a common problem that you understand from the Post Office point of view and the sub-postmaster point of view, don't you?
Yes, I do understand that.
Which is why the benefit of the doubt should be given. If a sub-postmaster says, this is what's happened, I'm afraid I can't find the document, I buried it, I lost it, I didn't want to think about it, that can affect whether they have the documentation, can't it?
Of course it can, yes.
Now, the Horizon Convictions Redress Scheme, which is there to deal with criminal convictions overturned by legislation, as we understand it, 335 letters have been sent out to roughly a cohort of well over 1,000 people that were convicted over the years through the Post Office's prosecutions and the scandal. 335 letters doesn't seem to be the right number, Mr. Reid.
Is this the scheme that's run by the government, or is it the scheme that's run by...
That's government.
Yes.
But it's a scheme that relates to the convictions that are being quashed through legislation.
Understood.
335 letters only have been sent out. So essentially it seems as though there'd been identified 335 people to get letters that deal with their convictions, telling them that they've been cleared. More work needs to be done in this area. It is clear. Do you accept that?
This is the government scheme, so it's difficult for me to comment on the detail.
Well, I was going to ask you, Mr. Reid, does the Post Office have any involvement in administering that scheme? And I use the word any. For example, is it incumbent upon the Post Office to try and identify people which it prosecuted?
We obviously are.
Just by way of an example.
I mean, I was about to come on to tracing. I think that's clearly
yes.
what we're discussing here is the ability to trace, and clearly we have an accountability for that because many of the records will be held by Post Office, but as we've already discovered, records aren't and data isn't as.
Sure. But what's interesting me, following Mr. Steen's questions, is whether there is a process as between the Post Office and a government department. And again, I'm using the word a government department because there's the possibility that the Department of Trade is involved. There's the possibility of the Ministry of Justice is involved. What is the process for trying to track down all these people?
I don't have the specific details, but you're absolutely right that there is an operational agreement between the Post Office and the Department for Business and Trade, because the Department for Business and Trade is obviously responsible for this particular scheme. The mechanics of how that scheme works and what the operational KPIs in terms of the sort of time it takes to do disclosure and the time that it takes to do the tracing and the investigation, or not the investigation, but the ability to diagnose those databases is obviously something that's part of the operational agreement between the two parties. I don't have the specifics behind that.
Fine.
So what this means, Mr. Reid, is this, that it seems almost 5 months from the passing of the Act, which is the Post Office Horizon System Offences Act 2024, more than 60% of the victims of this scandal do not know that they've been vindicated. That's what it appears to be the current situation.
If that's what you're telling me, I'm not familiar with those statistics, to be fair.
On the giving of information so that the scheme can have its operation, so that people can know that they've been vindicated, so that they know that they're entitled to have compensation. You've just answered the questions from the chair in relation to information going from Post Office. That's clearly a job that the Post Office needs to do. Have you considered this with the NFSP? Because they will also have lists of individuals that have been members over the years. Have you considered that possibility of joint working with the NFSP, get the message out, but also whether they have names that could assist?
I don't know whether that's been considered. It may well have been considered. This isn't specifically an accountability that I'm particularly close to be fair.
But it's work that needs doing.
Oh, clearly it is, yes.
And would you join with me in making a request to the chair that the chair himself would, if he would be so kind, can send a message out to all media outlets, and I think it's sometimes called a blog these days. I don't know whether we'll do a blog, but it would assist if this inquiry set itself out and made a very clear message to all of those people that have been dealt with so harshly by the Post Office, that are being convicted, to come forward? Yes?
I absolutely want that to occur. We've talked to the CCRC, we've talked to the advisory board, we've talked to the inquiry, we've talked to the drama that was played at Christmas in an attempt to try and get communication out for people to come forward. We have tried numerous and multiple attempts at tracing, and we've used Citizens Advice, we've used many other outlets to try and do this. I agree with you, Mr. Steen. It's very, very frustrating, but we must continue to try and push this.
And you accept that there's more joined-up work to be done in relation to this, whether with the NFSP, there are 3 firms of solicitors that represent a number
Absolutely.
of people before this inquiry. They should be tapped for their expertise.
Absolutely.
They're conveniently all starting with the letter H, Howe & Co., Hudgels and Hodge, Jones and Allen.
Indeed.
Okay? So use their expertise, I respectfully
agree.
suggest, in making sure that the message goes out. Lastly, mentioned earlier, you and others within the Post Office have been meeting with our clients.
That's
and
correct.
taking part in meetings that I know have been difficult for you, obviously incredibly difficult for the people that meet with you.
Indeed.
You're leaving the Post Office. Other people that have been taking part in those schemes are also leaving the Post Office. How are you going to make sure that the Post Office keeps the term used is corporate memory, keeps its memory of the effect of what happened to people? And what are you going to do to make sure that people working with the executive team, the directors that are not postmasters, actually understand the depth of hurt and feeling of the scandal?
We're doing a number of things. I think, as you mentioned, I've done a number of restorative justice meetings over the past couple of years. I think 37 I have attended. I speak at great length to the organisation at my town halls and at my 10 at 10 meetings to try and convey the trauma and the harm, was the word that I tend to use, that has been inflicted upon many of the families involved. I've spoken to government about it and obviously encouraged my board members and my group executive members to attend the restorative justice meeting. I think it helps shape the solutions that we should come up with and help people in the organisation to understand the implications of this. We've recently instigated, as Ms. McKeown mentioned, online and e-training for all colleagues in the Post Office to help people understand just what the Post Office has put many of your clients through.
Let me square a particular circle. You mentioned families.
Yes.
Mr. Patterson, the European director of Fujitsu, when he gave evidence before this inquiry, answered my questions. And I asked him questions about whether Fujitsu, the company, broad shoulders financially, is prepared to support people that have been affected through this scandal. What I mean is the family members, the children who watch their parents go through hell, that have had their education disrupted, that may have been put off an entrepreneurial career through this scandal. There's no scheme that deals with those individuals at the moment whatsoever. Have you had any communication from Fujitsu to the Post Office saying that, what a good idea, let's get something done for the families, those people affected in that way? Have you had any communication from Fujitsu to that line?
I don't believe I have.
Has the Post Office set up any schemes that are looking in the direction of support, of providing educational support, bursaries and the like, in relation to those people affected in that way who are not currently set up by affected by the schemes?
We are still having conversations with DBT about this. I can assure you, and you'll be able to talk to Simon Recaldin next week, that both of us are absolutely clear that the families of victims need to be considered in this process. And there are two lines of investigation for us here. One is working with DBT to bring this to life. We do believe it is very important, and I mentioned it in my witness statement, that it's something that I personally am very engaged in. And secondly, we've obviously discussed, and at the restorative justice meetings as well, just precisely what some form of memorial, some form of ability to remember what has occurred and how do we put that into practice. So those are the two lines of investigation that I am pursuing with DBT.
I've asked you on a number of occasions through the questions I asked you within what is, I'm afraid, sadly over an hour, to in the remaining period of time that you have at the Post Office, to take on particular tasks. I'll ask you one more. There are going to be communication with Fujitsu regarding the question of how that they're dealing with the Horizon system.
Yes.
We know that. Mr. Relton's committed to that. You've had past communications. In whoever is conducting the communications with Fujitsu, can this topic again be raised? Support, making good the positive answer that we have from Mr. Patterson, that Fujitsu does think it's a good idea to try and assist those people, the family members that are outside all these schemes. And perhaps by working hand in hand with the Post Office, something good can come out of this scandal to support those family members that are also being affected. Do you also commit to that as well?
I think it's a very good idea, Mr. Steen.
Thank you. Excuse me one moment. Just need to check I'm not missing anything. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before the next question, Mr. Reid, can I be clear on the list of schemes that you and Mr. Steen agreed were in existence, that the suspension remuneration scheme, that is administered by the Post Office, I take it, and the decisions about how much to offer are made by the Post Office, having taken advice. Is that the position?
That's correct, sir. Just to bring that to life, in Fraser Jay's judgment, he noted that suspensions had not been on full pay, so there were individuals who were suspended with no pay at all. We're trying to address that particular shortcoming.
Right. And what was described as the adequacy of HSS payments, if that is to be considered a separate scheme from HSS, nonetheless, that is administered by the Post Office. And who is the decision maker in relation to that?
The remediation committee oversees the schemes that we manage, and clearly, as I discussed yesterday, the funding will come from government, and so they will be involved from an operational perspective in terms of what the parameters of those schemes are.
Yeah, but can I take it, if it has been fully formulated, if it hasn't been fully formulated, please tell me, but is the adequacy of HSS payments effectively being determined, I'm not saying by the same people, but by the same process as the HSS payments themselves, namely that an independent panel look at it and make a recommendation to the Post Office?
The scheme itself hasn't been fully formed, sir.
All right, so stop there.
Yep.
There isn't yet a process which I can say, right, that's what they're doing, sort of thing.
That's correct, sir.
Fine, thank you. Next one, please.
So yes, due to the operation of Mr. Steen's watch, I'm going to rejig things slightly for logistical reasons. It's Miss Watt on behalf of the NFSP.
Right.
Good afternoon, Mr. Reid. I'm over here. If you can see me, we do sometimes have a little difficulty with this. I ask questions on behalf of the NFSP. I'm here today with Tim Boothman, who's the chair of the NFSP. I may be able to just about see him round the,
I can't see
round the pillar.
Hello, Tim.
I want to ask you some questions, a number of different questions. I think you would agree, in the light of the Horizon scandal, that one of the most important initiatives for the Post Office is its replacement and giving confidence that nothing like Horizon can happen again. Would that be right?
That'd be right.
At paragraph 11 of your witness statement, you say that the Post Office has been unable yet to deliver a new and bespoke IT system for postmasters. Now, it's understood that that new system to be introduced is called NBIT, New Branch IT, is that right?
That's correct.
Is it the case that the NBIT system was originally due to be in place in 2025 and that those postmasters in, for instance, what we know as hard to place scheme were scheduled by the Post Office to leave the network before NBIT went live?
That would be logical. I think we certainly, when we set out in March 21, which was the original date for initiating the programme of NBIT, we had envisaged that the replacement for Horizon would be in place by 25. Insofar as you're linked to the hard-to-place branches, that's obviously a scheme that was established during network transformation. It's a scheme that is extended, I think, by nearly 10 years in total. So I'm not quite sure the two necessarily dovetail together. I don't think there is a particular link between those two schemes.
Is it the case that the Post Office has already purchased at least some of the hardware, and that by the time NBIT eventually rolls out, that hardware could be out of date?
We've certainly purchased some of the hardware. I don't know the specifics of whether it'll be out of date or not out of date, but yes, we have.
Are you familiar with, and do you agree with the Computer Weekly report that we've heard about, which states that the development of NBIT will cost taxpayers over £1 billion, lacks quality, and could be unachievable?
It's quite a lot to unpack in that particular statement by Computer Weekly. I think it's fair to say that the replacement programme for NBIT has certainly increased in cost in terms of our budget, and is certainly going to take longer to deploy. I don't think at this stage that it is realistic to suggest that it's not going to be fit for purpose. Certainly the 250 postmasters who are involved in the IT forum that helps shape the development of NBIT haven't provided that level of feedback. I would agree it is definitely slower than we would have anticipated. And I would also agree that the difficulty of getting off Horizon in 2015 that was experienced by IBM, which was the first time that we, as I understand it, wanted to get off Horizon, those challenges are just as prevalent today. And I think the level of complexity associated, the technical complexity associated with getting off Horizon has been underestimated. And that is one of the core reasons why the delays have and the costs have increased.
Would you accept that the Post Office has not been fully open and transparent about the development of NBIT as it should be, especially in the light of Horizon?
No, I don't think that's the case. I think we have we've wrestled with getting the delivery of the releases out on time. As I mentioned before, we have a number of postmasters who are helping us with this in terms of the IT forums, and we believe that we've been as open as transparent with them about what's going on, and their feedback has been instrumental in terms of trying to shape things.
Well, I'm not going to call it up, but you may have seen the evidence. But at paragraph 277 of Callum Greenhouse witness statement, that was WITN 00370100, he says that on the 29th of May this year, he met with you and others at the Post Office, and the NFSP were asking about NBIT, and we were provided with an update. However, the following day, Computer Weekly broke the story that NBIT was unachievable. Whilst we knew it was running late and over budget, at no point in the meeting of the previous day were we told it lacked quality, according to the auditors for the Department of Business and Trade, or that Post Office had asked for nearly £1 billion to fund the project, or that the Infrastructure and Projects Authority were now involved, or that the project had been brought into the Government Major Projects portfolio. Would you agree that the Post Office, which failed to be transparent about Horizon, is now failing to be transparent about NBIT?
No, I don't think that's the case. I do recall that Callum, and I think Tim did too, came to the offices, I think amongst a range of different topics we talked about where we got to with NBIT and the progress that we were making. So I don't necessarily agree with that statement, no.
I'd like to turn to a different topic now. In paragraph 20 of your witness statement, you state that around 4,000 post offices are loss-making, and also for the loss-making, also for the postmasters who operate them. and that is around 1/3 of the post offices in the UK. I want to ask what you have done during your time, or are you going to do, to reduce the central costs of post office to help improve the viability of postmasters in the running of their post offices?
I think there are two core drivers to increasing remuneration for postmasters. I think one is to drive revenue and therefore to be innovative with new products and services. And the second, obviously, is to reduce the operating costs associated with the centre, but also the operating costs associated with running a post office in and of itself. So just taking those one at a time, if we think about the introduction of MBIT and the replacement for Horizon, we believe that the operating cost of doing such a thing will reduce by about 60%, and that will be both for branches themselves as well as for the centre. So that will reduce a run rate of around 60 million a year to Fujitsu to anywhere between sort of 20 and 30. So that will be probably the main driver. I think secondly, we've been on a trajectory of trying to reduce the headcount within the post office since about 2016, 2017. I think we were at 7,500 heads in 2016, 2017. We're now at 3,400. I would fully recognise that we have further to go, and I'm sure that the strategic review will look closely at the central costs to make sure that we continue to reduce those central costs. So I think that would be my secondary point. The third point, obviously, is the way to increase the revenue for these particular branches is to make sure that we can drive footfall and ensure that the products and services we are selling in post offices are relevant to today's consumer. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about how we are central to cash and central to financial services, as well as the major strategy that has been deployed by the Post Office over the last 18 months, which is clearly our multi-channel, multi-product strategy, employing the likes of Amazon and DHL and DPD and Every in our branches. So I think it's a two-pronged strategy would be the biggest way to describe this. One is to continue to innovate and deliver new products and services, and indeed allow postmasters to share in some of the digital developments that we've made, particularly with our savings products, but also to make sure that we continue to cut costs. It's the crucial way to, and the most obvious way to drive profitability.
Just going back to the strategic review that you mentioned in part of that answer, given that Network Urban Reinvention 2003, Network Change 2007 and Network Transformation 2012 did not provide a post office that was fit for purpose, nor did it improve viability or security of postmasters' investment, is it not the case that the strategic review is just another way of transferring risk and cost from the post office onto postmasters?
I think I said on Wednesday that I had a great concern when I took over the post office in 2019 that postmasters had been left behind in a drive for profitability, commercial sustainability, and the agenda associated with both of those two from a post office perspective. And we've tried to address that. I think Nigel is very, very alive to the desire to have a new deal for postmasters and, as I mentioned earlier, the polarity issue in terms of making sure postmasters are front and centre. Given what you've said, I'm not that familiar with the 3 or 4 specific strategic reviews that have been conducted since the early 2000s. I think the scrutiny and spotlight that this inquiry has placed on the Post Office is such that it would be impossible for us, even if we wanted to, which we don't, to do anything other than make sure that the strategic review is for the benefit of postmasters. That is what the Post Office is all about, serving 10 million customers every single week in our post offices. It's not about the centre.
Now, my final question, or it's a series of questions, different topic. I'm going to do some summarising and then I'll ask you some questions. I'm going to call up a couple of documents. You've been asked by Council to the inquiry about the continuing issues with the culture of the Post Office. You've also been asked questions about the Past Roles project and its failure to conclude within the almost 2-year period it's been underway, and that's with regard to those who were involved in the pre-2015 Horizon scandal issues. You probably remember those questions.
Indeed.
And I think your position is that following the judgments in the GLO, cultural change is important, and from your perspective has taken place at least in part. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I think your position is that the Past Roles project is an important one,
Yes, it is.
not least to give sub-postmasters confidence that the culture and attitude towards them has indeed changed.
Absolutely.
So I would like to ask you about something specific in respect of those 2 points and to suggest to you that there's actually a direct effect between those 2 things on sub-postmasters and their representative body, the NFSP. Now, in this phase, the inquiry has heard evidence from the 2 postmaster NEDs and from Callum Greenhow, the chief executive of the NFSP, and I think you've said you heard at least some of that evidence or
I
so.
did, yes.
As to how near impossible it is to get anything done, that's done today, which benefits sub-postmasters such as remuneration. And in his evidence, Mr Greenhow put that down in large part to the culture at the post office, that it has not in fact changed and needs to change in order for there to be a real difference for some postmasters. Now, under your 5-year leadership, there are some people who were there during the peak of the Horizon scandal era and who today deal with postmasters and postmaster issues. I'm just going to give a little list and then I'm going to ask you some questions. So there's Nick Beale, head of network, which we understand includes the NBIT project, and who gave evidence on behalf of the Post Office to Mr Justice Fraser. Martin Edwards, the former Chief of Staff to Paula Venos, who is now Network Strategy and Delivery Director. Tracy Marshall, Head of Postmaster Engagement, who we saw in the emails yesterday was providing reassurance on the remote access issue back in 2011 and has a senior and extensive role in relation to postmasters and is in fact the very person the NFSP has had to deal with over a good number of years on almost every aspect of sub-postmaster discussions and negotiations. Would you accept that sub-postmasters will likely find it incredible that someone who assisted Angela van den Boogaard in 2011 with reassurance on remote access is the very person with whom their representative body has to deal on all of the issues associated with sub-postmasters?
First and foremost, as I said yesterday, I'm very clear that we will not walk past allegations of wrongdoing or misbehaviour. And when they are presented to me and when they are presented to the organisation, we will address them. And that stands firm. And I explained how that process was going, both with past roles and with Project Phoenix yesterday. And I still stand by that. Where there is, and this is materially different, where there is an issue of confidence, then clearly we need to have sensible conversations with individuals to invite them to step back and to make sure that the confidence of postmasters is sustained. That is the single most important thing, and I absolutely agree with you. However, as I said before, where allegations are made and when they are explicitly made, we will investigate those individuals and make sure that anybody who was involved in any activity in the past is addressed.
Just to be clear, my questions are about the confidence that sub-postmasters and their representative organisation can have, as opposed to any specific allegations of wrongdoing. So just to be clear about that.
I understand.
I'd like to call up a document which is WITN 00370106. And to go, well, this is a letter from the NFSP, from Callum Greenhow, to the then Postal Affairs Minister, Kevin Hollingrake, of January. And if we could go, it's following the Mr Bates versus the Post Office ITV drama. If we could scroll to page 2 and look at the third paragraph, the one that begins, the NFSP has raised concerns internally. Just to read that paragraph. So this is a letter to Minister Hollinrake about the various issues arising from the drama. The NFSP has raised concerns internally with Post Office that there are still employees of Post Office who were involved in internal discussions about bugs, defects or errors, where directions were given for minutes not to be taken or were part of the investigation, audit and contracts department, who hold roles that are postmaster facing. We are not confident that the correct review has or will be taken. We can take that down. Would you accept that the NFSP was right to bring this issue to the attention of Minister Hollinrake? I mean, that's a year on from you starting your past roles project.
Of course, it's absolutely in the rights of the NFSP to discuss anything about the Post Office with the Minister, and I would encourage them to continue to do so if they felt that we were in some way failing. I think it's important to highlight, and I said it yesterday, that we are frustrated that the Pass Rolls project has not gone as quickly as possible. I mentioned that we had 1,700 colleagues in the organisation who have been in the organisation for in excess of 10 years. There's a lot of investigative work to do, a lot of data to cover, and a lot of people to ensure that we are making the right decisions. This is not something that we can follow some of the practices of the past, should I say. It's very important that we get this right and that we give people who have employment rights the right level of opportunity to express precisely what it is they may or may not have done. So the investigative work has been slow, and I would agree with that, and I acknowledged that yesterday. I would have much preferred it to have been quicker, but as I say, I can give you confidence that we will not walk past any allegations and we will not walk past any wrongdoing by individuals who are in the organisation today that may still be operating.
Well, Mr. Reid, not just slow, too slow, would you not say?
I did say that, yes.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to call up another document. That's NFSP 00001471. This is an email from Callum Greenhow to you of April 29th, 2024. That's this year. And he's sending it on to you so that you can send it to the Post Office Board. He's saying he doesn't have all the addresses of the Post Office Board. Can you pass it on? So he says, I write to the Post Office Board after watching the events in the Horizon inquiry over the last few days. It's once again highlighted employees at the Post Office who in the past were part of the obfuscation of the truth in relation to the accuracy and reliability of the Horizon system and its use in the victimisation of postmasters, their assistants, Crown Office employees, and the ruining of their lives. Some of these employees of Post Office involved in the past remain employees of the Post Office today, where their present roles is very much postmaster facing or are indeed in senior management position. This information is not unknown to the board, yet as a group there has not been any action taken to remedy the situation. How many more current employees will over the remainder of the Horizon inquiry be revealed to have been aware of the inaccuracy and unreliability of the Horizon system, be involved without the Board of Post Office Limited taking the required action? This is not the first time I have raised this with the Post Office. I'm sure you will appreciate that as a group of postmasters ourselves, we are growing increasingly concerned that we keep having to deal with those individuals who have been involved in the most reprehensible behaviour towards postmasters, and indeed, as has been repeatedly stated, and he goes on to talk about what was said at the inquiry. To be clear, it is imperative that the board takes the required governance remedial action to identify any and all current Post Office employees. And he goes on to say that if the board fails to take its governance action, then it would fall to the current postmaster non-executive directors to resign on this point. Now, if we take that document down. This is Mr. Greenhow raising directly with you in April this year and asking you to take that to the board. What did you actually do with that email?
It was circulated to the board. It certainly formed part of the discussions that we as a board have had since that time on past roles, and I will refer to the comments that were made by Karen McKeown last week in her evidence about how seriously this is being taken at the board, about how complicated it is, and how much debate and discussion is going on at a senior level. As I said earlier, we would like this to be much easier, and you will have seen emails that have come up in the evidence from me on this particular topic. It would have been much easier if this was a very simple process. It isn't. We're trying to deal with confidence of postmasters. We're trying to deal with individual rights of colleagues, and we're also trying to deal with an investigative work to find out if there are allegations that are substantive to wrong behaviour or past behaviour. So it is a complicated piece of work, I agree, and it's not easy for us to come down on a left or right decision. It's much more nuanced than that, I'm afraid.
Did you know that after that email of the 29th of April, that the Post Office intended to send those same people to the NFSP's annual conference on behalf of the Post Office until Mr Greenhow asked the Post Office not to send them?
I wasn't aware of that, no.
Just a final question then. So would you agree that, given the Past Roles project, which you have said started almost 2 years ago, it is in fact a disgrace and disrespectful to sub-postmasters that those involved in the past, not about wrongdoing, but in front-facing postmaster roles, are involved in so many matters that affect the postmasters today?
No, I don't think it's a disgrace. As I said before, we are not going to have a witch hunt unless allegations are made very clearly, and that is still my position. I've been very open and said that we will remove individuals where there is a lack of confidence, and that is something that we are obviously working through, and Karen, as she mentioned last week, was doing exactly that.
Thank you, Mr Reid.
So we've got two sets of questions to come now, 45 minutes from Mr Maloney and 10 minutes from Miss Allen on behalf of Susan Sinclair. There are two options. One, we could take a 10-minute break now, i.e. a second break for the morning, and then do those 55 minutes of questions and not have lunch. Or we could do Miss Allen's questions now for 10 minutes, take lunch, and then come back after lunch for Mr Maloney's questions. I'm in your hands, sir.
Well, I'm content with either course. Is there a consensus amongst the people present in the hall as to what we should do?
I'm looking at the shorthand writer in particular. If you could hold up one finger for option one, and she said option two. So I think Miss Allen now, lunch break,
and then lunch.
Then Mr Maloney. Thank you.
Right. Fine.
So over to Miss Allen then.
Good afternoon, Mr Reid. I'll stand up so you can see me. But obviously I'll sit to do my questions. My name is Christy Allen, and I represent core participant Susan Sinclair, who is a wrongfully convicted postmaster. She was the first to successfully appeal her conviction in Scotland, which only happened as recently as September last year, despite her being convicted in 2004. You provided evidence yesterday about the Post Office's engagement with the CCRC, that being the Criminal Cases Review Commission in England, and indeed Mr Henry put it to you that as soon as it came to pass that there were serious problems with Horizon, and certainly upon receipt of the Horizon Issues judgment in 2019, the Post Office ought to have been banging on the door of the CCRC and Crown Prosecution Service in England and Wales, begging for them to come and review these cases as the convictions were unsafe. To which you answered, yes, I see where you're coming from. Notwithstanding this, you refer in your first witness statement to a number of meetings with Post Office's board, which did eventually occur with the CCRC, albeit 2 years later, regarding the criminal appeals in England and Wales and Post Office's role as a prosecutor. In response to Mr Beer's question to you earlier today, you confirmed that, as far as you are aware, the Board of Post Office has not engaged with the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission or Crown Office albeit the remediation subcommittee was potentially overseeing those matters. Can you therefore tell me about any proactive steps that Post Office took, particularly in light of the Horizon Issues judgment in 2019, to immediately seek to rectify the miscarriages of justice which occurred in Scotland as a result of Post Office's failings in its duties of disclosure?
I'm not close enough to that particular issue that you're describing. As you rightly point out, the remediation committee has been engaged in those matters. I don't sit on the remediation committee. Again, I'm fairly certain that Simon Ricaldin, who is a subject matter expert in this area, will be providing evidence next week. No, wrong. I think it's on November the 4th, in fact. He's obviously going to be much better placed to comment. I don't want to sort of muddy that water.
But to be clear, the Post Office's board didn't engage with the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission or Crown Office?
Not as a board. It may well have been the case that the remediation committee did, or indeed that the remediation unit did. I'm afraid I don't have that detail.
You've repeated over the course of 3 days the fact that since before 2015, and indeed before your appointment, the Post Office ceased to privately prosecute postmasters in England and Wales. Remind me again the reasons for this?
Sorry, could you want to repeat the question? Sorry.
Before 2015 and before your appointment, the Post Office ceased to privately prosecute sub-postmasters in England and Wales. What were the reasons for that again?
Well, why did they cease to
Yes.
to prosecute? I mean, clearly.
Can you answer that, Mr.
I'm not sure I can specifically.
I think that's probably quite a complex answer to that, and it all occurred before Mr. Reid was imposed. So I think
Yes,
I have as much information as I'm likely to get on that from the previous phases of the inquiry.
Thank you, sir. I'll move on. And in your evidence on Wednesday, when asked by Mr. Beer whether Post Office's current investigative function is fully compliant with all relevant legal standards, you confirmed, as far as I'm aware. Is that correct?
As far as I'm aware, yes, that's correct.
You are aware, Mr. Reid, that Mr. Beer asked you what your response was to the Lord Advocate, Scotland's most senior law officer, stripping the Post Office of its role as a specialist reporting agency in Scotland earlier this year. And you confirmed that it's not an enormous surprise that this decision has been made. Why does that not come as a surprise?
Well, I think it's in keeping with the direction of travel of the last 5 years since the HIJ and CIJ were handed down. I don't think that would come as a great surprise to me. That's my point.
And prior to this, Post Office, in its role as a specialist reporting agency, was an organisation who could investigate and report crimes directly to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, the independent public prosecutor in Scotland, as opposed to having to first report this to other law enforcement agencies to investigate, such as the police. Is that your understanding?
I'm afraid I don't have the level of detail that you're suggesting. Prosecutions haven't occurred since 2019, since I've been in position. In fact, they haven't occurred since 2015. So forgive me, but this level of detail is not something that I am aware of.
Well, that would be what a specialist reporting agency does, and that was Post Office's role prior to May earlier this year when it was stripped of that role. And the Lord Advocate, in deeming that the Post Office is no longer to be fit as a specialist reporting agency, also confirmed that in light of the Post Office's failures, work is now underway to strengthen the guidance and safeguards that exist to ensure that all specialist reporting agencies abide by the essential duties of disclosure and candour in Scotland, thus inferring, and she went on to confirm, that the Post Office did not. Mr. Reid, is it really correct that Post Office does not have an official response to being stripped of its role as a specialist reporting agency in Scotland?
I'm afraid I'm unable to answer that question. I don't follow your train of thought and what you're trying to ask me to answer. It's a little bit too nuanced for me, I'm afraid.
So there's not been any discussions in light of the Lord Advocate's stripping?
No, there hasn't.
No.
Not that I'm aware of.
Not
at board level.
No. and there's no review work under planned by the Post Office to review this?
It's nothing that's come to the board that I'm aware of. As I mentioned before, Simon Ricaldin is probably best placed to discuss this when he comes on November the 4th.
On the basis that due to a failure in candour in reporting by the Post Office to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, how, therefore, if there's no review and there's no discussion taking place, will Post Office now ensure that it acts with candour in providing evidence of suspected criminality to other law enforcement agencies, such as the police, if not now directly to the Crown Office in Scotland?
I think Mr. Bartlett, when he comes next week to articulate and describe the role of the new investigative function, which he will do, the Assurance and Complex Investigations team, he'll be able to articulate very clearly how the team is constructed, who is in that team and what their objectives are, particularly around engagement with law enforcement agencies. And I'm sure as part of that, he will be talking about the jurisdictions that you are referring to.
And Mr. Reid, I would say it's not just those jurisdictions, it's reporting criminality to any law enforcement agency in any jurisdiction. Can the Post Office now be trusted to do that with candour, despite the fact it didn't do that in Scotland?
Yes, I believe they can. And as I mentioned yesterday, we are liaising with law enforcement agencies on specific elements of organised crime and the like, and clearly trying to support those agencies wherever we can in terms of the level of detail that we support and supply.
Thank you.
Right, so we'll break off for lunch now and resume when, Mr. Beer?
So could I say 20 to 2?
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you.